So lots to think about then as we carry on with the press preview. Our first look at what is on the front pages as they come into us here at Sky. And tonight we'll see what is making the headlines with economics correspondent at the Spectator, Kate Andrews, and political editor for the new Statesman, Stephen Bush. Very good evening to both of you. Speak to them in a moment. First of all, let's take a look then at some of those front pages. And unsurprisingly, they're all focusing, of course, on the Prime Minister's plans to gradually lift lockdowns, starting with the Times. PM sets out 4 tests for the end of lockdown, highlighting that new criteria for easing. Stay at home to be scrapped in the Telegraph. The Guardian leads with school, sports and social contact first as Prime Minister plans to lift lockdown. Return to the great outdoors, says the Mirror. On the front of the newspaper, outdoor sport and rule of 6 in March. And in the Daily Mail, the headline, Slow March to Freedom. The Express focuses on the government's cautious attitude, with Boris will take it one careful step at a time. And the 4 steps to freedom is the headline in the Metro. And as I say, joined tonight by Kate Andrews and Stephen Bush. Great to see you both. Thanks for being with us this Sunday evening. And a huge amount of anticipation as to what the Prime Minister is going to say tomorrow. And a lot of the detail we've been given tonight for the front pages. Let's start, Kate, shall we, with the front of the Daily Telegraph. Stay at home to be scrapped as PM unveils route to normality. What do you make of what we've just heard from Sam about how things are going to be eased?
Well, as Sam said, it's going to be a very cautious approach. It's going to be a longer easing of restrictions than it was in the first national lockdown for a lot of industries, especially for hospitality. In March, you are going to be looking at more outdoor activity, with it being legal to socialize instead of just exercising with one person outdoors. And then by the end of March, hopefully the rule of 6 will be coming into effect, or you'll be able to have 2 households meet up, even if that exceeds the rule of 6. But it's going to be a tough time for the hospitality industry, which is being told that they're months away from being able to reopen. And I actually think the key thing on the front of the Telegraph isn't simply the timeline, but the fact that social distancing is thought to be in place for many, many months. Now, a lot of the industry has said, look, we're not enjoying being shut down, but what's really important is that when we're allowed to come back, we can do so with a bang. For a lot of these industries, it's going to be very difficult to operate at, say, 50 or even 75% capacity and turn a profit. So the fact that social distancing will remain for the foreseeable future, even with vaccines, is going to be a really tough pill for a lot of the hospitality industry to swallow. Yeah, it really is. Stephen, clearly the government being incredibly cautious, not wanting to repeat any mistakes that were made in the previous lockdowns.
Yes, I think this plan does show that the government has learned from some of the mistakes it made, particularly over the summer and into the early winter, which is one problem we had, is because we opened everything at once. We weren't able, when cases started to rise, to be able to work out what we could keep open. We were forced essentially to go, right, let's just close everything in a bit of a panic. So I think it's a very sensible approach for that reason.
Yeah, and just staying with you, Stephen, we're hearing about these 4 tests, and actually there is positive news on all 4 of the Prime Minister's tests at the moment. Just having a look at the front of the Metro, they outline them in a bit more detail, the 4 steps to freedom. Clearly, the first step is going to be the reopening of schools, and it sounds as if there isn't going to be a staggered approach. It's going to be all kids back at the same time.
Yeah, so that does contain a slightly bigger risk in terms of the R8, but of course we do have a very successful vaccine rollout program, and of course we do also know that the cost to children of not being at school is pretty high. And actually this is the important thing, as you say, on all 4 of these metrics, that all of the lights are at the moment flashing green, with the really important proviso that the only country with a more advanced vaccine rollout than we have, Israel, has very good news, but they have good news about the Pfizer vaccine. The thing we don't know yet is how effective the Oxford vaccine is at preventing transmission. We know it's important at protecting you from hospitalization and death. What we don't know is whether or not it's good at preventing you giving it to someone who doesn't have the vaccine.
Yeah. Kate, the one thing we're all desperate to do, of course, is socialise again, meet up with family and friends. And clearly that is going to happen now, albeit in a very slow and measured way. How do you think this is going to go down with the public? Because the polls have all suggested that they don't want anything to happen too fast.
Yeah, what we've seen throughout the past year is that the public have been very forgiving of the government, very understanding when we've had to crack down on these restrictions, and also broadly speaking, very compliant. Although there have been some questions around the most important rules, like staying at home when you have symptoms. But when it comes to many of the other rules, we have seen that people are broadly quite happy to do it. I do wonder, as the vaccine program, if it does continue to be a success, no reason to think it won't be. In fact, the Spectator's vaccine projector suggests that we could be hitting the top 9 priority groups even before the end of March. Whether or not people will still feel the same ethical responsibility, that is, once the risk of potentially harming the elderly, your grandparents, even your parents starts to fade, whether or not you will get more pressure from the public, not just, say, backbencher conservative MPs, to lift some of these restrictions. Because, as I said before, this is actually a slower process of opening up than it was last year when we didn't have any working vaccines. And I think if we look to those 4 tests, it's actually important to break them down. As Stephen says, we're flashing green on all 4, but 2 of them, one that is linked to infection rates that they wouldn't put any risk on the National Health Service, and the other about a no new change in variant. These are rules that you could see the government, you've got enough leeway there, enough flexibility, that you wouldn't even necessarily have to make the case in the data to say we want to slow down even more. And I think that's when the Prime Minister might start getting even more pushback from those in his own party and potentially the public, as people are really keen and eager to have a summer that feels a lot more normal than last summer when we didn't have any of these vaccines.
Yeah, let's talk about the summer. Front page of the Daily Mirror, return to the great outdoors. They talk about people meeting in the park for a drink or a cup of tea or whatever it might be, sport resuming March the 29th. But they also make the point that holidays in Britain and beer gardens will be allowed in April. But there's no talk about international travel. And of course, a lot of people wanting to book a summer holiday. The travel industry absolutely on its knees, saying that travel should be brought back by May, given how well vaccination is going. Stephen, do you think we'll hear anything about that tomorrow from the Prime Minister?
I doubt it. And I mean, to be honest, I don't really think that hospitality has got a particularly reasonable case here, right? The pace of vaccination in other countries is not really something that the government can control. They can help in countries where the pace of vaccines is slowed because countries don't have sufficient means to procure as many vaccines as they have, which is something we're doing through COVAX and through the Global Vaccines Initiative. But through countries which are doing it slower for other reasons, where it's not simply a matter of giving them money or giving them vaccine supplies, ultimately, that is a pretty hard constraint on the ability of people to go on holidays further afield if they so desire.
Yeah, well, where do you stand on this, Kate? Because if vaccine passports in some form are brought in and the majority of adults have had the jab by the summer, can it be a situation where the government can say, well, look, you still can't go away?
Well, Stephen makes a very important point that a lot of international travel comes down to what's happening in external countries, not simply what's happening at home. But you've already had indication from very popular destination points like Greece that they plan to open tourism this summer, almost regardless of their vaccine status. I think it's going to be very difficult for the British government, which has vaccinated its population for anybody who wants to take the jab, to say, well, you are being invited elsewhere, but we're not going to allow you to go. Now, there has been some talk today that foreign holidays might be on the cards for later in the summer. But again, you're actually looking at potentially a more restricted summer on the domestic and international front, certainly towards the beginning of the summer than you were last year. And that's something that the government is going to have to square, because if vaccines, perhaps silver bullet is the wrong term, but if they are the game changer, and all of the data so far would suggest they are, and hopefully in the next few weeks we're going to get even more data, as Stephen pointed to, about the real world effect on transmission when it comes to the Oxford vaccine, well, then that really should be the ticket that we need to start going back to normal, both domestically and abroad, because the threat in the UK will hopefully subside.
Yeah, and Stephen, just a quick final thought from you. Front page of the Daily Mail, slow march to freedom. I mean, they do talk on their front page about the agony going on for shops, pubs, hair salons as well. Kate's already mentioned this, but of course there are so many businesses, aren't there, and walks of life that are still going to struggle, even despite the Prime Minister announcing an easing of some restrictions tomorrow.
Yeah, they're going to have real problems and they're going to need more subsidy. At the moment, the subsidy regime is for wages and rent, two very important costs. but they assumed the idea that people would be able to still have a big Christmas, a profitable Christmas. That hasn't happened for most of these businesses. So they are almost certainly almost all going to need a further injection of government supply if this timetable is going to be kept to without having a huge cost in terms of unemployment and bankruptcies.
Yeah, of course. OK, Stephen, Kate, thank you for the moment. Don't go away. Coming up, the end of lockdown is looming. We look at plans for schools, sports and socialising. That's coming up after the break. Hello again, part two of the press preview. Kate and Stephen still with me. Let's look at the front page of The Guardian. Kate, Matt Hancock in the news for different reasons. Friend of Hancock in inquiry over COVID work. Tell us about this.
The Guardian's reporting that the UK Medicines Agency is investigating a company named Hinpack for possible breaches in hygiene and safety standards. Now, the reason this is getting front page attention is because the company is owned by a former neighbour of Matt Hancock, who was given a very lucrative government contract to create vials for the NHS last year during the pandemic, despite the company not previously having experience in making this in this particular thing. Now, it should be said that Alex the company chief, says that he's not aware of this investigation. It appears, according to the Guardian's reporting, that it's just starting. There are no findings yet. Innocent till proven guilty. All the rest certainly apply. But I suppose it's an important reminder that many of the normal proceedings were suspended last year. A competitive bid to get a very lucrative government contract basically went out the window for many companies because of the emergency laws. But it's always better when these things can be transparent, especially when it comes to taxpayer money.
Yeah, of course, all allegations so far, as you say. The government saying constantly that it was an emergency situation. They were under huge pressure, of course, to deliver. Let's move on to the front of the Daily Telegraph, Stephen. And it's all talk about everyone's got a roadmap, haven't they, at the moment, including, it would seem, Donald Trump. He's been setting out his roadmap to 2024.
Yes, he's speaking at CPAC, which is the kind of it's sort of the biggest bash in the Republican Party calendar, and he's expected to stand up and confirm what we kind of all guessed, which is he's running again, obviously because he lost re-election. He's not term limited. He can run for a second time. I think it does show the blunder that a lot of Republican politicians made in choosing to defend Donald Trump rather than using the opportunity, A, because it would have been the right thing to do morally, but because it would have been the correct thing to do for their own political aspirations. And I think many of those senators who hoped that they would be able to become the presidential candidate are probably going to realize very quickly that as long as Donald Trump is on the political stage, that ain't going to happen. He's still very popular among the Republican rank and file, even though, of course, he's very divisive in the country as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, that's right, Kate, isn't it? You know, Donald Trump still has many, many millions of supporters.
He did. He got the second largest share of votes for a presidential candidate in history. The first, of course, was Joe Biden, which is why he won the election. I think Stephen's completely right. A lot of Republicans will find that they made a huge mistake thinking that they would be the candidate in 2024 by trying to be Donald Trump light or trying to defend the president and his policies, and now maybe realizing actually President Trump will fill those shoes. And it's the anti-Trump lot, those that acknowledge the huge mistakes that he made, especially on his way out the door, that may actually be competitive. But it's also a reminder of the problem of an electoral system where you don't have an opposition leader, you don't have a leader for the party that didn't win. It means that there is this void, and Donald Trump is such a big presence. It's no surprise he's going to try to fill it. And that means an uphill battle for the Republicans who want to move on from the Trump era and reestablish the party.
OK. And just finally, Stephen, back here, we're on the eve of a huge day tomorrow. What sort of tone would you like the Prime Minister to set as he speaks in Parliament and then speaks to the nation at 7 o'clock?
I would quite like him to strike as lucid and as accessible a tone as possible. As much as I enjoy hearing from school friends, people I've worked from in the past going, hey, mate, can you explain exactly what the Prime Minister's just said? I don't think it's a very good system. A lot of people don't have a school friend who works at a national magazine, and I think a little bit more clarity in his communication would be wonderful. OK, and a very quick thought from you, Kate, and just in a couple of sentences.
We need some optimism. I think the Prime Minister has overcorrected for being too optimistic in the past. It's been too pessimistic the past few months, and I'd like to see a return to not just normality, but the Prime Minister saying that we can get there and hopefully soon.